Level 0. A rash appears on your arm. You scratch it. It spreads. By morning, your neighbor has it too. Never a warning, never a siren. Just a quiet, invisible thing. By the end of the week, half your village is bedridden. That's how it starts. Humanity has been living with infectious disease since before we were even fully human. Disease is not a modern inconvenience. It is the oldest war we've ever fought. And for most of history, we were losing. The word plague gets thrown around casually. But when historians use it, they mean something else entirely. Events that killed so many people so fast that societies couldn't bury their dead fast enough. Level 0 is where disease is still something your body has a fighting chance against. Local outbreaks, a few thousand dead. Horrifying by human standards. But history shows something far worse than a village outbreak. Because the first time a civilization met a disease it had never seen before, an entire city nearly vanished. Level 1. Most people can name the Black Death. Almost nobody outside a history classroom has heard of the Antonine Plague or the Plague of Athens. Both were civilizational earthquakes. Both carry lessons that echo through every level of this list. 430 BC Athens, the most powerful city in the ancient world. Something arrives. Nobody knows what it is. Nobody knows how to stop it. The historian Thucydides survived it and documented every symptom. Intense heat in the head, inflamed bleeding eyes, violent sneezing, chest pain, convulsions, ulcers, the extremities blackening and falling away from survivors who wished they hadn't survived at all. 75,000 to 100,000 Athenians dead, a quarter of the entire city. It killed the general Pericles. Athens never fully recovered its golden age. We still, more than 2,400 years later, don't know what it was. Typhoid fever is the leading hypothesis. Ebola has been proposed, a mutant strain of measles. The Plague of Athens remains one of medicine's oldest unsolved cases. Then, 3 centuries later, Rome got its turn. 165 AD. Soldiers returning from the Near East brought something home their empire had never encountered. The Antonine Plague burned through Rome for 15 years, killing up to 2,000 people per day in the city alone. Emperor Marcus Aurelius watched it hollow out his armies while writing his private meditations. Reflections on suffering from a man watching everything he built dissolve in real time. 5 million dead across the empire. Both plagues share the same brutal truth. The deadliest moment for any disease is always first contact. No immunity, no defenses. The body encounters something it has never been taught to recognize. The ancient world burned offerings, prayed, fled. The disease followed, but these were just the opening act. Because what came next didn't just threaten a city or an army. It threatened to erase Europe's most powerful empire entirely. And it used something nobody suspected. A grain ship and a rat. Level 2, 541 AD. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian I is at the peak of his power. His armies have retaken North Africa and reconquered much of Italy. Constantinople is the most sophisticated city in the world. Justinian is within reach of reuniting the Roman Empire for the first time in a century. Then the grain ships arrive from Egypt, and they bring something else. Something waiting in the bodies of rats in the holds of those ships. The disease had a name. Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that would later create the Black Death. And it detonated inside Constantinople like a slow bomb. Historian Procopius reported 10,000 deaths per day at the outbreak's peak. Bodies piled into towers, dumped into the sea until it ran red. The city ran out of ways to dispose of its own dead. No city was ready. No city ever is. Justinian survived. His empire did not. The pandemic killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people across a century of recurring waves. The tax base evaporated. Military campaigns stalled. The grand reconquest of Rome was abandoned, forever. The mechanism was elegant in its horror. Roman grain trade was a global rat distribution network. Every ship carrying grain carried rats. Every rat carried fleas. Every flea potentially carried plague. Justinian's greatest strength became his civilization's greatest vulnerability. History pivoted on a flea, but Justinian's plague still had limits. The world it entered was fragmented, less connected. Slower. Give that same bacterium 800 more years, rebuild the trade routes, fill the harbors with ships again, and the result isn't a shaken empire. It's a dead continent. Level 3. October 1347. 12 Genoese trading ships dock in Messina, Sicily. Most sailors are already dead. Those still alive are covered in black, pus-filled boils, oozing blood from their armpits, groins, and necks. It was already too late. The rats had been ashore for hours. Within 5 years, the Black Death killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population. 50 million dead at minimum. Giovanni Boccaccio survived it in Florence. Fathers abandoning children. Priests refusing last rites. Crops rotted in fields because there was nobody left to harvest them. The plague operated through three mechanisms simultaneously. Bubonic plague caused swellings the size of eggs in the groin, armpit, or neck. Pneumonic plague spread through exhaled air and killed in 2 to 3 days. Septicemic plague entered the bloodstream directly, killing before symptoms even developed, sometimes within hours. 3 delivery systems, all circulating at once. Would you survive the first day? Plague doctors wore leather masks stuffed with herbs. Flagellant groups marched between cities, spreading the disease to every location they visited. Jewish communities were massacred across Europe on the lie that they had poisoned the wells. Society didn't just lose people, it lost its mind. Then gradually it stopped. Not because of medicine, because enough people had died that the transmission chains broke down. What followed was unexpected. Labor became scarce and valuable. Feudalism began its slow decline. The Catholic Church, which had offered no protection, no explanation, no cure, began losing its unquestioned authority. Some historians trace the Renaissance, the Reformation, the entire arc toward the modern world, back to a civilization forced to rebuild itself from ash. The Black Death traveled on slow, medieval legs, but the world was changing. Ships were getting faster, trade routes were expanding, and somewhere in that expanding world, a collision was forming that the Black Death couldn't match. Not in speed, not in reach, not in scale. Level 4. This one doesn't have a dramatic name, but in terms of raw proportional death, it may be the single most devastating disease event in recorded human history. When Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, the indigenous populations of the Americas encountered something their immune systems had no preparation for: the entire accumulated disease history of Eurasia and Africa, arriving all at once: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, diphtheria, mumps. Every major infectious disease from the Old World delivered simultaneously to populations that had never encountered a single one of them. European populations had spent thousands of years developing partial resistance through generational exposure. Indigenous Americans had none of that. Zero prior exposure, zero inherited immunity. Between 50 and 90% of the pre-contact indigenous population died. Between 50 and 100 million people. Entire civilizations erased within a single human lifetime. Hernán Cortés did not conquer the Aztec Empire with 500 conquistadors. Smallpox arrived before his army reached Tenochtitlan, killed the emperor, and devastated the population's capacity to resist. Cortés didn't defeat the Aztecs, smallpox did. European diseases frequently reached indigenous communities in North America decades before any Europeans physically arrived. Explorers found empty villages, forests already reclaiming fields abandoned a generation earlier. The continent the Pilgrims landed on was not a pristine wilderness. It was a landscape mid-collapse from a catastrophic population die-off. The scale of death was so complete that reforestation of the Americas caused a measurable drop in global atmospheric carbon dioxide, a dip identifiable in ice core samples from the period. The land itself recorded the death toll, written in ice, in carbon, in silence. But even this had an endpoint. The contact happened. The dying followed, and eventually it stopped. What comes next never really stops. It ran for 3,000 years. Kings died from it. Emperors died from it. Entire civilizations bowed to it. And almost nobody alive today has any idea just how close it came to winning. Level 5. If you had to name the single disease that killed the most human beings across the longest stretch of recorded history, it is not the Black Death, not the 1918 flu, not HIV. Smallpox wins, without argument. Conservative estimates for the 20th century alone, 300 million dead in 100 years, more than both world wars combined. And that's just the 1900s. It killed Pharaoh Ramesses V, Queen Mary II of England, Louis XIV of France. It was so omnipresent that parents frequently refused to name newborns until the child survived their first exposure. You waited to see if they lived. Variola major killed between 20 and 60% of those infected. In infants, the mortality rate reached 80%. Survivors were frequently left permanently blind or scarred so deeply their faces were unrecognizable. The first crude prevention came from China and the Ottoman Empire. Variolation, deliberately introducing smallpox material into a small wound. It killed 1 to 2% of recipients but was dramatically safer than natural infection. Then, in 1796, physician Edward Jenner noticed milkmaids who contracted cowpox seemed mysteriously protected from smallpox. He inoculated an 8-year-old boy with cowpox material, then exposed him directly to smallpox. The boy didn't get sick. The word vaccine comes from vacca, Latin for cow, born from a milkmaid's hands and a country doctor's curiosity. In 1980, the World Health Organization made an announcement never made before in the history of medicine. Smallpox was eradicated, completely, extinct in nature. Humanity fought it for 3,000 years and somehow won. But victory over one disease didn't make the world safer, because the next plague wasn't waiting in the wild. It was already growing inside the modern city, in the water, in the pipes, in the filth beneath millions of feet. And it was about to teach humanity that progress and pestilence travel together. Level 6. The 19th century gave disease something it had never fully had before: the modern city. Industrialization compressed hundreds of thousands of people into dense spaces with no sewage infrastructure, contaminated water shared between thousands of households, and zero understanding of how disease moved between bodies. Cholera was designed by pure evolutionary accident to exploit exactly that. Vibrio cholerae infects through contaminated water. Once inside the small intestine, it triggers violent diarrhea and vomiting so severe a person can lose lethal amounts of fluid within hours. The body drains itself to death, blood thickens, organs fail. The skin takes on a sunken bluish tint as circulation collapses. Healthy adults die in hours, not days, hours. 7 major cholera pandemics between 1817 and 1975, originating in India, spreading to devastate Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Americas in successive waves. Millions died across every inhabited continent. In 1854, physician John Snow mapped every death in London's Soho outbreak onto a street map. Every cluster pointed back to one water pump on Broad Street. He removed the handle. The outbreak stopped almost immediately. Snow's work planted the seed of epidemiology, the science that still tracks every outbreak on Earth today. Born from a map and a removed pump handle, cholera still kills. Between 1.3 and 4 million people develop it annually. The 7th pandemic began in 1961. It has never officially ended. Cholera follows water. Fix the water, stop the disease. That logic gives you something to fix. A pump handle to remove, a pipe to replace. The plague that came next gave humanity nothing to remove, nothing to fix, nothing to see. It was invisible. It was airborne. And it had an entire world war to help it spread. Level 7. World War I killed approximately 20 million people in 4 years, the deadliest conflict the modern world had ever produced. Then, in the final year of that war, something arrived that made it look small. The 1918 influenza pandemic killed between 50 and 100 million people in roughly 18 months. The war had built perfect transmission infrastructure, millions of soldiers packed into trenches, moving through embarkation ports connecting every continent. When a virulent H1N1 strain emerged, the greatest possible global network for spread was already fully operational. A world war had connected every population on Earth. The flu used every single one of those connections. Most influenza kills hardest at the extremes of the immune system. The 1918 strain inverted that entirely. It killed healthy adults between 20 and 40 through a cytokine storm, an immune overreaction so extreme the body's own defenses destroyed lung tissue faster than the virus could. The stronger the immune system, the more catastrophically it turned inward. Your greatest biological defense became the weapon that killed you. One military physician described it simply: healthy soldiers march into camp. In the evening, they are dead. Western Samoa lost 22% of its entire population in weeks. Philadelphia held a public parade despite explicit warnings. Bodies were later collected by horse-drawn wagons because the city had run out of coffins. Some historians argue the pandemic altered the Paris Peace Conference. Wilson, severely ill during negotiations, may have been compromised enough to accept the punitive terms that became the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that set conditions for the rise of Nazi Germany, the Second World War, one virus, a chain reaction that may have reshaped the entire 20th century. Every public health system built afterward was shaped by what 1918 revealed. Every outbreak since has been benchmarked against it. But 1918 spread slowly by today's standards. It needed weeks to cross an ocean, months to reach every corner of the globe. The next plague on this list didn't need weeks. It needed a single needle, a single moment of contact. And it spread for years before the world even admitted it existed. Level 8. Every plague on this list spread because nobody could stop it. HIV/AIDS is different. In the critical early years, the tools to slow it existed. The knowledge of transmission was developed relatively quickly. And in the United States, the government chose, for years, not to act, because of who was dying first. The virus was identified in 1981, initially in gay men and intravenous drug users. The Reagan administration went 6 years without the president publicly uttering the word AIDS, while tens of thousands of Americans died. 6 years? Tens of thousands dead. The president never said the word. HIV targets CD4 T cells, the immune system's command and control infrastructure. Without them, the body receives no orders and cannot respond to anything. HIV doesn't kill directly. It dismantles the system, protecting you from everything else. People didn't die from HIV, they died from everything else once HIV removed the ability to fight any of it. 40 million dead worldwide to date. 38 million people currently live with HIV, the majority in sub-Saharan Africa, where access to treatment remains deeply unequal. The science that emerged transformed medicine far beyond HIV. The mRNA vaccine platform that produced COVID-19 vaccines in under a year was built in significant part on research infrastructure created during the AIDS crisis. The crisis the world mishandled funded the science that saved it later. A broadly effective vaccine still doesn't exist after 4 decades of research. This is a plague humanity is still inside of. And while scientists were still searching for a cure, while millions were still dying, a new virus was already moving. It didn't discriminate. It didn't care about politics or stigma or funding decisions. It traveled on breath. And within weeks of its emergence, it was on every continent on Earth. Level 9. You lived through this one, which means you already know how fast it moves and how unprepared the world was. SARS-CoV-2 was first identified in Wuhan, China in late 2019. Within 3 months, it was on every continent. The WHO declared a pandemic in March 2020. Official global death toll over 7 million. Excess mortality estimates place the true figure between 15 and 20 million. The gap between those numbers is the full story. Overwhelmed hospitals, deaths that went uncounted, people who couldn't access care because every bed was full and no system was ready, not a single one. The vaccines authorized in 2020 and 2021 were a genuine historic achievement. The mRNA platform delivered safe and effective vaccines faster than any in the history of medicine, preventing approximately 20 million deaths in 2021 alone. Science moved at a speed the world had never seen. The distribution did not. Wealthy nations stockpiled doses while lower-income countries waited. Variants emerged in under-vaccinated populations and spread globally. The miracle of the vaccine was real. The failure of its distribution was also real. Long COVID introduced a category that didn't fully exist before. Persistent fatigue, cognitive dysfunction, cardiovascular damage in people never hospitalized. Millions experiencing lasting disability from an infection many assumed would be nothing serious. The full consequences are still being measured. We survived it, unevenly, and not without permanent cost. Compared to some viruses currently circulating in animals, COVID-19 had a relatively lower fatality rate. And right now, in bird flocks and bat caves and crowded farms, something else is waiting. Something with a case fatality rate that makes COVID look like a common cold. Scientists have already named what it could become. They just don't know when. Level 10. The World Health Organization has a formal designation for it. Disease X, not a specific pathogen. A reserved category. A slot held open for a disease that doesn't yet have a name, but that the world's leading experts are certain is eventually coming. It is not a theory, it is a forecast. H5N1 avian influenza currently circulates in bird populations worldwide and has begun appearing in mammals with increasing frequency. Its confirmed case fatality rate in humans sits at approximately 60%. The 1918 flu, which killed up to 100 million people, had a fatality rate of roughly 2 to 3%. H5N1 is currently missing one thing: efficient human-to-human transmission, one mutation, one viral reassortment event. That is the only distance between what H5N1 is today and what epidemiologists call a civilization-level threat. Nipah virus kills between 40 and 75% of those it infects. No approved vaccine. No approved treatment. Current outbreaks are contained because transmission chains break quickly. If that changes, the world's response options would be extraordinarily limited. No vaccine, no treatment, just containment and hope. We have germ theory, genomic sequencing, global surveillance networks, mRNA platforms capable of producing vaccine candidates within days of a new pathogen being identified. Real advantages built on the suffering of every level on this list. But we also have 8 billion people, 4 billion in cities. Every major population center is reachable by air within 36 hours. And increasing human contact with wild animal populations, every one of those contacts is a potential crossing point for something that has never encountered a human immune system before. The conditions that produce pandemics are not disappearing. They are intensifying. Every plague on this list began the same way: contact between a pathogen and a population that wasn't ready. The Plague of Athens, the Black Death, the Columbian Exchange, 1918, HIV, COVID, every single time. The history of plague is not ancient history. It is a pattern. It repeats. It accelerates. The next pandemic already exists somewhere on Earth. It might be in a bird, a bat, A farm animal? Or a city of 10 million people? Only one question remains. When it appears, will we recognize it in time?